I won't be buying Grand Theft Auto 6 either. Myself, I have no intention of buying it. Um, Not the least of which because of the fact that it's just a digital download of the game, and that's just not good enough for me personally. But, the thing about this is that we're being like, I don't know, certain people in certain segments are basically, implying that we're like physical media exclusives and purist and everything, and that we refuse to adapt to, the future and everything, and then want to make this about us being stalwarts and, old man yelling at cloud and everything and protesting the market clearly is moving in, but I recently came across a statement about physical media that struck a nerve with me in the most fundamental of ways and everything. It just hit, and it hit really, really, really hard when the person pointed it out. And that logical argument was essentially they can't take it away from you. And I had to think about it, and I had to think about it. Sony just recently cut off people's access to a considerable amount of their library on like the content side, where people were buying access to like some of their movies and that sort of thing. On it didn't affect gamers; it affected like cinephiles and people that just went to watch something like TV, that sort of thing. But they were all pulled up and swept in it, and they got cut off from a huge segment of their streaming libraries and everything from these platforms and everything. I mean, you may act like I'm a dinosaur that has, basically refused to adapt to technological change. And honestly, I still do things the old way, like I torrent a lot and everything and pirate that way and everything. I never really left the 7 Seas. I interact with XGC bots and everything on internet relay chat. And yeah, I mean, I am a little bit that way and everything. I've got everything set up just the way that I want it to go and everything. But, that argument was essentially they can't take it away from you once you have a physical copy. And that's the problem, in all this and everything. But, I could pretend to be more pissed off about this than I actually am in reality. Now, I'm not happy with Sony about all this, but from my vantage point, I've been making video after video about how Sony has been shitting the bed for a while now. Ha, like I have been stewing in disappointment towards Sony for some time now. So the fact that this shit can just blew up in their face, I'm just kind of like, finally, I'm going to enjoy watching Sony, speed run its way to an early grave here. I'm not as pissed as I might come across in, wanting third-party developers to, abandon them in droves and go over to the dark side with Nintendo and everything, and to advocate that and all that, and everything. And I want you to know I'm not like a Nintendo like loyalist. I'm not all like Nintendo is like all of my support for them is very conditional at the end of the day. I mean, they won me back by the fact that the DS was as good as it was, and had so many of the type of games I wanted to play on it. That the 3DS was more of the same, and then the Switch was just like that on fire. It was like my favorite console of all time and everything because it had RPG after RPG after RPG after role playing game after role playing game, and many of them were turn based. And if you want these JRPGs, you pretty much have to be like a Switch person at this point. There's no way because nobody else is catering to us at all. Sony abandoned us a long time ago. I mean, look at the PlayStation 5. They basically think they have all their bases covered because they've got a few of like Octopath Traveler on it and Metaphor Refantaso and everything on the PlayStation 5. But they're not exclusive to it. So there's no compelling reason if you're able to access that content with your Switch and your fucking PC, why the flying pig fuck would you buy a fucking PlayStation if that's what you're into and everything? There's no fucking point to it. The very thing that justifies the purchase of a console is that, you're buying into an ecosystem where, there are exclusives that you're not going to be able to access any other way. That's what makes the purchase of the console itself worth buying in the first place. And I've been kicking myself wondering why the fuck I bought that thing. And the only answer that I can come to is I thought that we were still living in the world we were before this came about and everything. Before these times, I thought there was going to be a greater diversity of games, but what I have witnessed for the past couple of years is that Sony is absolutely desperate to replicate something like Fortnite and get, capture that lightning in a bottle that, cannot be replicated and everything with this live service thing. And they've spent millions and millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on flop after flop after flop after flop. And, I think we forget, on top of that, that they've pulled a lot of third parties into their shit storms and everything because we talk about this like it was Concord, then High Garden, then Marathon that was, Concord 3.0. But the reality is that, it was Concord, then Forspoken with Square Enix and everything, or that one game that they made that nobody fucking played or adopted and everything, and then it was, High Garden, and then it was, Marathon, which would be Concord 4.0, really, in reality, if you consider the Square Enix flop that got pulled into all this and everything. And so, it's been a pretty moment of just absolute disappointment towards Sony for a long time. I've been stewing in it for some time. I mean, I also have to complain about their cell phone side of the equation. Sony is so incredibly conceited and arrogant, you know, and it shows in their strategy when it came to the Xperia phone and smartphone. See, the only reason why I found out about the Xperia is that I researched because I wanted a higher end smartphone that would be happy in its performance of just doing. And I don't use my phone for much, but I don't want to have to wait, 10 minutes while it's loading and switching windows to do the few things that I do with it. I don't want to be sitting there waiting around for things to respond. And so, this is going on, you know, and everything. And so I'm trying to get one of the ones with the better processors in them and everything, just because I don't want to be sitting around waiting to switch windows where the phone, basically takes a while to switch gears from one window to the next as I switch task. Not a lot of fun, so I wanted a higher end one. Despite the fact that I don't really game on my phones and everything, and I was looking for that, and I was looking for one that had micro SD card support, and what I found was that the Xperia was the only one that actually still was on the higher end of the market and, basically offered micro SD card support on the phone. And, this has been going on now for some time, and it's been a frustration that's been boiling over within me towards them for a while. But the problem with the Xperia, the primary complaint I have about it is that they abandoned the US market. They're not selling anymore. And so a lot of the people that offer wireless services are not necessarily willing to let us bring their phones onto their network if we imported it from overseas because they're not selling within the US market. So that means effectively an untested phone that they don't know what the performance of and what the features of it will be operating on their network, and they're concerned about that sort of thing and everything. And so they don't want to do that. They don't want to allow you to get service for it on the American side of the equation. But the big thing that pissed me off about the experience was Sony cut not a single advertisement for, you know, tech magazines, television, or any of that thing. They did put out a YouTube video about it. That was about it. That was the full extent of the marketing that they did with it, and they thought that would be sufficient. But it just goes to show you the absolute arrogance that has seeped in to Sony to think that they didn't need to spend anything cutting ads for television, for the radio, for tech magazines or other websites on the internet, that covered cell phones and the Android side of the equation. They didn't think they needed to advertise at all and the world, and everything, and has punished them, for it, in that the United States didn't adopt the Xperia phone much at all. The sales were incredibly anemic, and Sony was sitting around like, "Why? We deserve it. We've made a really great phone," and they had, legitimately, but almost nobody in the U.S. bought one because of the fact that they didn't even know it existed. And why not? Because they didn't advertise. I mean, and this is, it just goes to show you the absolute arrogance that has seeped into the company. And now they're abandoning physical media on top of everything else. But, I was sitting there and I'm like, you know what? There's this perception of Concord, for example, like it only failed because of the fact that it was, you know, the characters and the art style was pretty woke at what Firewalk Studio produced and everything, and it just kind of came across in a way that alienated gamers and everything that wanted something more traditional looking and everything. But the problems go so much deeper in that Sony has decided that they really only seem to want to market to the same crowd. They want to compete for the old uh crowd of people that used to go into stores and buy games for the PC and everything, because what I know about that crowd, at the end of the day, that crowd was very full of people who wanted to play something like Doom, Duke Nukem, those sorts of games and everything. Those first person shooters, right? They were all the rage, and to a certain extent, they are all the rage with gamers and everything. But what wasn't being missed is that people were buying other styles of video games who didn't want a fucking shooter. And you know so I can confidently tell you Marathon's failure and everything, and the failure of Concord and High Garden and all of this is because they were making a style of video game that not everybody wanted, and that didn't appeal to huge swaths of the gaming community and everything, who wanted a different style of video game, who wanted to play some other genre of game and everything. But fuck us, right? We're not a priority at all for them and everything. Square Enix recently launched, a new Final Fantasy that was turn-based and everything. It's off the main branch and everything, but it was an adaptation of Brave Exodus and everything. When they did this, I felt seen by the company. I appreciated it to a huge extent and pre-ordered it day one. I didn't even wait around. It was hour zero basically when I had pre-ordered it with them and everything. I was like, shut up, take my money. I've been desperate for something like this for a while because, I finally felt seen by the company and everything. But I don't feel seen by Sony. I feel abandoned, left out in the cold to rot and everything. And I've been screaming at them for a long time, but they don't give a shit what I've been telling them. They don't care, you know? And it makes me mad as hell. There's a huge amount of videos here on this platform that talk about where are the games for the PlayStation 5 and everything. And to me, the problem runs like, for a while it was like there was nothing on the PlayStation 5 that almost anybody really wanted to play. And now that we're deeply into the console's history and everything, I'm not everybody, but there's nothing I want to fucking play on the damn thing. Nothing. They have Octopath. They have, you know, they have one of my favorite Atlas games, that Metaphor Refantaso and everything. But I can play those on the Switch and the PC. Why the fuck would I go and play it on the fucking PlayStation 5 when I can access it on the platform that I actually deeply prefer, which is the PC? Why would I go down there and everything and boot up a console and pull myself away from my computer to go play and hook it up to the TV and deal with all of that hassle when I can just play it on my fucking laptop? So, the truth of the matter is that I come across as if I'm more pissed off than I actually am about this whole physical media thing. But you have to keep in mind, I've been stewing with this disappointment for a while now. I've been upset with them for a while now. I've been angry for a while now. And so as a consequence, that anger has tempered a little bit. It's not as intense as it did, was at its origin point. It's still there. It's still simmering in the background, but it's not a raging boil because, it's kind of like, oh, hey, this is par for the course for all the shitty things that the company has done. See, I don't really care that much at the end of the day. I have no intention of buying, Grand Theft Auto 5, 6 and everything. I thought the original was a pretty nifty concept. It looked a lot of fun and I liked the radio guy that was on the radio a lot, that channel and everything. I think a lot of people had that experience with it and everything, but I never really got all that into it, and everything. I just played it for a while, thought it was fun for a while, and then I moved on. I never really started the actual scenarios of the story and started to advance in it and everything. And all that, and it was fun for a while, and it was cool to watch other people play and everything, but it wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to play myself. And after a while. And so, like I didn't play 2, 3, 4, 5, so I'm not gonna be playing fucking 6 or buying it and everything. And the truth of the matter is that after all this time and all this disappointment, I'm thinking really hard about selling my PlayStation 5 onto the market because I have lost faith, you know, in Sony. I've been screaming from the rooftops that they needed to buy more intellectual property, and that not only did they need more intellectual property that was in their wheelhouse, but they needed something that catered to my fucking taste in that fucking wheelhouse, which means a turn-based RPG that is exclusive to Sony and has a high quality story attached to it. But they don't have that. And I think that there's been an inbuilt attitude of bullshit, going back a long time to some of the old people that used to work for them, of entrenched bias against JRPGs and everything, where they'll tolerate them on their platform, but they don't really want them around all that much. And so, as somebody that pretty much only plays turn based RPGs, that means that, effectively there's two companies in the gaming space that exist at all, which is Nintendo and Steam. Nobody else exists at all from, that perspective and everything because nobody else is doing anything, at least as far as first party platforms, to win your attention. Now, of course, Square Enix and Atlas and, Game Arts and a few others and everything have been making games for me. And there's a few others, new, smaller indie studios catering to me on Steam and everything, of people who grew up playing these games and wanted to write a love story to them and everything. And I've been giving their games a shot and everything, and slowly inching my way into the Steam, and Valve ecosystem, which I'm not really all that deeply into and everything. And so I look, out at everything and I see what's going on, and I've been disappointed with Sony for a while now. And one thing that happens with anger is that even if you don't forget your anger, it starts to decrease in intensity after a while. Especially if it's been simmering for a while. So yeah, I'm pissed. but I can't say that I'm as pissed as I was when this whole thing began, you know? And part of the problem that I come across as more pissed off too is that I've been talking about when you talk about it, you tend to get stuck in it. It doesn't dissipate. You just get mired in it because you're expressing it, and then it builds up and builds up and builds up, and talking about the things that piss you off doesn't really release the anger. Is one thing that I've discovered, at least for me. Getting it off my chest doesn't really dissipate it. It's the time and distance from things that does dissipate the anger. That's the reality. And so, I've been mad at Sony for so long now that, this most recent announcement is just kind of par for the course, everything. And so, I've been screaming at Sony. I've been using every available means to reach out to them and everything and to say what I wanted to say. I mean, I've even sent a letter in the snail mail to their, American office and everything. And I'm tempted now to draft a letter to their office in Japan and everything, expressing the sentiment of feeling abandoned by them, left out in the cold, ignored, and everything. And that I've been screaming at the American side of the equation, but they're not hearing me and everything, or at least they don't give a flying pig's fuck how I feel about anything, you know. So I've been screaming for a while now, like, and I have outright stated, I wouldn't play a game like Bloodborne, but I feel the anger and the frustration and the hurt and rage of the Bloodborne fandom pretty heavily because although we're talking about different games and styles of games, our anger and our discontent rhyme. It's the same discontent, but just for a different type of game. You know, it, and so I feel that. I feel their pain directly. It rhymes in such a way where it's the exact same pain, just taking a different form and everything. And so they're not. Uh, just. Uh, Fortunately, Nintendo's been there, and Valve has been there, and Steam has been there the whole time, about all this. But, this most recent chapter, I'm just gonna sit here and watch, you know, the fireworks at this point. I want to go pop some popcorn and watch and enjoy Sony's downfall and its speed run towards its own destruction and failure. You know, Anyways, thanks for your 20 minutes of listening to me rant. Really 23 if you're still here, which somehow I doubt, but if you are, thank you for your for listening to me rant and everything. And if you want, like I said, the reason why I'm such a you know, purist for physical media, at the end of the day, is very simple. I've watched Netflix and all the other streaming platforms take people's content away for years. I've been reading the headlines about that content that's been taken away. I'm a Lewis Rossman sub, and so I hear about it every time it happens and everything from Lewis for the most part. And you know, as a consequence of all of that, and downwind from all of that, the sentiment, is they can't take a physical purchase away from you. They can't, and so, all you people that are laughing at us like we're just old men yelling at clouds, you know, remember this video, remember this comment when they take the fucking thing away from you and everything, when they revoke access because a licensing disagreement happened. Remember that I said this about why, physical media was a virtue and everything. You think we're just dinosaurs that are refusing to adapt to the times and everything and to accept the reality that the market is basically mostly buying digital. And what I can tell you is you may think that, but everything I do the way I do for a reason. I may be doing and using tech the old ways, and everything, but I do it all for a reason. Like, why would I hate Slack so viciously and strongly and use IRC? Because IRC clients are very undemanding on my system. You can run them sitting there in the background and idle in channels forever because it doesn't interfere by utilizing so many resources that it slows other programs and games and all that other stuff that you use your PC for down. You know? So it's like, yeah, I I am a little bit of a tech dinosaur. It's true. But the old ways were better for a reason.